Well, I think we may begin. I'm Mark Elliott. I'm the director of the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies, and as director of the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies, it's my privilege and great honor to welcome all of you to the 2014 Edwin Reischauer Memorial Lectures. This year's lectures, as you know, are being presented by Professor Nancy Schatzman-Steinhardt of the University of Pennsylvania. As you also know, this series traditionally has always comprised 3 lectures. This year is no exception. Today is the first, and tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, we will have the second and third lectures in this series. Each lecture begins at this time, 4:15, and in this place. So if you found us today, you should have no trouble tomorrow. You should have an easier time tomorrow, since you won't have the same security gauntlet to run, which I gather has been set up for the President of Ecuador, who I'm hoping will turn up at any moment. We'll see. There will be a reception following the conclusion of today's lecture and Q&A at around 6 o'clock, and that's just outside here in the concourse. Let me take this opportunity to thank the Reischauer Institute for Japanese Studies and the Korea Institute for graciously co-sponsoring these lectures, and also to express my appreciation to the wonderful staff at the Fairbanks Center, led by our executive director, Lydia Chun, for the work that they have done in putting this all together. Now, I'll introduce our speaker in just a minute. First, I want to say just a word or two about this lecture series. The Reischauer lectures are really the high point of the academic year for us at the Fairbanks Center. This series was established in 1985 by then-director Rod McFarquhar to honor Edwin Reischauer by celebrating his distinguished contributions to East Asian studies at Harvard. 1985, some of us may remember or know, marked the formal creation of the Reischauer Institute for Japanese Studies. Its independence dates from that time, and we've been celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Reischauer Institute this year. That also meant its separation from its previous governing unit, which was the Harvard Center for East Asian Research. And the Reischauer lectures remind us every year of the need to continue to think of East Asia holistically, even though we are now separate institutes: Fairbank for China, Korea, Institute for Korea, Reischauer for Japan. Of course, we have the Asia Institute as well, which didn't even exist in 1985. And this year's lectures, conforming to this idea of thinking of East Asia holistically, bear the title East Asian Internationalism and Beyond, Crossing Borders in Chinese Architectural History, and it promises to be a terrific addition to the series. I sometimes get asked, how come the Fairbanks Center sponsors the Reischauer lectures? Shouldn't the Reischauer Institute sponsor the Reischauer lectures? The simple answer is that the Chinese studies at Harvard, and in the US for that matter, owes a lot to Ed Reischauer. Reischauer earned his degree here at Harvard in the Department of Far Eastern Languages, as it was called, in 1939. He earned the second degree ever given in that department. And it was in Chinese studies, with a special field in Japan. That dissertation, of course, ended up the famous book on the travels of Edwin to the Tang court in the mid-9th century. It was published in 1955. And this book really epitomizes Reischauer's scholarly breadth and offers a point of departure into understanding East Asia beyond any kind of narrow national boundaries. Apart from that, for years, Reischauer taught the Harvard's most famous, most popular course in Chinese history, rice paddies. That began in 1939, the year that he finished his degree. He taught the first half of what was called Chinese 10, and that was pre-modern East Asia. John Fairbank taught the second half, which was modern East Asia in the history department. And they taught that class together for about 25 years until the mid-1960s, at which point rice paddies split and there was a Japan survey and a China survey. But for 25 years, he taught Chinese history here. So that's another reason why the Fairbanks Center thinks it's totally appropriate to be sponsoring the Reischauer lectures. Not to mention the fact that he and Fairbank co-authored the most influential textbook for East Asian history, Traditions and Transformations, which has been through, I don't even know how many editions over the years, and certainly many generations of people grew up on that book. And of course, I don't mean to downplay this. Reischauer did dabble in Japanese history from time to time. He did, in 1942, importantly, he taught Japanese, an introductory course in the spring term, to which he recruited promising Harvard undergrads. And there is an alumnus of this Japanese language program with us today. It's Professor Howard Hibbett. And I hope he won't mind my calling attention to his participation in that seminar again this time. The lectures this year, given by Professor Steinhardt under the theme we have. Professor Steinhardt is Professor of History of Art at the University of Pennsylvania, and she is Curator of Chinese Art at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology at the university. She earned her master's degree and PhD degrees here at Harvard with a dissertation on imperial architecture under Mongolian patronage, Kublai's imperial city of Dadu. And she completed work on this project while she was a junior fellow in the Society of Fellows. This was the first of many fellowships that would come her way, including a Guggenheim in 2001 and a CCK Foundation Fellowship in 2012. She's the author of many books. I won't list them all here. The one I have, my favorite, I guess, is the book on Liao architecture. But we have many others, including a major book over 500 pages long, coming out later this year, Chinese Architecture in the Age of Turmoil, published by Hawaii. And she's presently working on a brand new book on the history of mosques in China. She's the co-editor of a couple of different books, many, many articles and reviews, exhibition catalog essays, encyclopedia entries, and so on. She's much in demand as a speaker in this country and around the world. She's a dedicated teacher, mentor to many, many PhD students, a very popular teacher at Penn. Her innovative and path-breaking work has established her as the world's foremost expert on the architecture of the Liao. And she has spent her whole career really doing brand new work in the history of Inter-Asian architecture and Chinese architecture. She has the same energy as when I first met her 20 years ago. She never slows down. She was in Mongolia this summer. We'll see some evidence of that in today's presentation, as I understand, where she was doing field work, sleeping rough in the steppe. This is something we can only admire. Her lectures for this week have been well publicized. Today's lecture, The 6th Century as the 7th and 8th, Recentering an International Age in Chinese Architectural History. We are joined today by our colleagues Yukio Lippert and James Robson, who will provide some comments on the lecture at the end, following which we'll have some Q&A. I'll introduce the two of you a little later on. Right now, I would like to ask you to join me in giving a very warm welcome to Nancy Steinhardt.
Thank you very much. We can probably turn down the lights in the back. I think somebody will know how to do that. Thank you, Mark, for that overkind introduction. Anytime I stand in this building to give a talk, there are faces in the audience to whose teaching and mentorship I've owed so much in my career. Most noticeably missed today, John Rosenfield, Joe Fletcher, and Oleg Grabar, my 3 dissertation readers. But they and others in the audience, teachers, colleagues, are responsible for research and guidance that will be reflected in what I do this week, I'm grateful and I am extremely humbled by this opportunity to present these lectures. I probably met Edwin Reischauer at a Yenjing welcoming party. I certainly passed him in the halls of 2 Divinity Ave between 1974 and 1981. Like many here, my introduction to him was this book. I probably should have taken my own blue copy instead of what I got off the web with an ISBN number. But I used this when I was a freshman in the version of rice patties that I took. But my true introduction to Edwin Reischauer was when I read this, the book that was just mentioned. The idea of a monk pilgrim who traveled from Japan to China in the middle of the 9th century confirmed notions about an international Tang, the importance of emissaries who crossed from Japan to China, even one who was incarcerated by the Chinese government. The impact of the plan of a 7th, 8th, and 9th century city, the famous capital city Chang'an on the left, on the city plan of Nara and other cities in East Asia at the time, and that it was fitting that the oldest buildings in China were on Mount Wutai, on the left, where Edwin had traveled and found their sources in Nara, Japan, and that Edwin had touched Korea but had not traveled through it, because indeed Korea was not part of the narrative in the 1970s. But this was what one learned at that time, and it would guide research for at least a decade afterward, until we had open access to buildings across China to see enough so that we could make new assessments. Like my teachers, I first went to Japan to study old wooden buildings. I believed that they informed me about China, and I didn't get to Korea till the 1990s. The tendency to look to Japan to understand Chinese architecture has been driven by 4 forces. The first are on the screen. The 22 oldest wooden buildings in East Asia are in Japan. Number 23 is this building, and yes, it is on Mount Wutai. Second, 21 of the 22 oldest buildings in East Asia are Buddhist, the one on the top right, residential. The documentation for the transmission of Buddhist doctrine from China directly to Japan or from China to Korea to Japan is solid, and it was logical that Buddhist architecture in Japan could inform us about non-existent buildings in China where the same sects of Buddhism were practiced. The third and fourth reasons for understanding China through Japan take longer to explain. Third is what I like to call the field-defining problem of Chinese architectural history. And it's true, we shouldn't be embarrassed to say it. Why does so much Chinese architecture look like so much of the rest of Chinese architecture? And in terms of our topic today, is Japanese architecture really that different? It is a fact that the earliest notched wooden timbers date to circa 5000 BCE from Homudu, and we find pictures of them in an architectural treatise dated to the 12th century. And if you watch the repair of the Forbidden City today, you see craftsmen notching timbers in the same way. It's a fact that a plan that looks like a capital I, 2 large buildings connected by a corridor, is used in the Forbidden City and traces, at least today, to 1200 BCE, and surely there will be earlier versions of it found. In fact, much of what we say about Chinese architecture can be put into about 10 basic principles. Chinese buildings build along horizontal lines, major axes, and less major axes with spatial magnitude expressed along the horizontal. A vertical building always sticks out in China. It always looks somewhat unnatural on the Chinese landscape. Chinese buildings build around 4-sided enclosure. Those enclosures always have one focal building, but the buildings are never considered independent structures. Implicit in the name of a building like palace is that it's actually a group of buildings, and they also build around courtyards. Gates, always important in Chinese architectural space, they mark the entry to the whole, and they separate the more sacred space behind and the more profane space in front or outside. The core of a Chinese building is a flexible timber frame. Every component of that frame is modular. That module determines the rank. The building on the right is elevated on a higher platform, has more complicated bracket sets and a different kind of roof, and it is more eminent, and we can always tell this even if we can't tell the date of a building. But the fact is that Buddhist or Taoist, Confucian or funerary or palatial, Jewish or Islamic, from a garden or for a residence, built for the delight of imperialists and aspiring colonizers, or just for people seeking pleasure inspired by the Orient. All of these are secondary labels that are often apparent only when one gets inside a building or reads an inscription or a stele. The features that make Chinese architecture recognizable also render it recognizably exotic out of context. That's what you saw right here. But this ability to export and to make these features is because of the clarity, the simplicity, and the strong and powerful imageability, to use Kevin Lynch's term, the imageability of a building. And because Chinese buildings are so straightforward to copy. That's why it's been possible for Chinese civilization to maintain this profound cultural symbol, architecture, in the face of foreign influence. Part of the success of the system is that it's comprised of standardized parts like bracket sets and roofs and just a few very straightforward building types, halls, pagodas, the main one. Structures, however, that readily lend themselves to imitation, so that China and architecture are the dominant messages of almost any wooden building. The fact is that the Chinese timber frame easily reduces to a stick figure. But what this means is that anyone who aspires to empire as it exists in China can erect one of these buildings for a palace or for a temple as a first step, and then modular movement inside means he can transfer an altar to a throne or vice versa, and the exterior remains the same. Whether or not the fact that 13th century architecture so closely resembled 9th century architecture is related to notions such as letting the past serve the present is worth considering. James Watson uses the phrase cultural standardization in referring to the perpetuation of ritual, particularly funerary rites over long periods of time, writing, "Herein lies the genius of the Chinese approach. The system allowed for a high degree of variation with an overarching theme of unity. In other words, bracket sets evolve and can help us date a building, but they always interface with pillars, which always interface with a roof frame." The lack of change, however, even at the approach to the 20th century, is what is so impressive. Because by the time we hit the year 1900, theorists worldwide are telling us important messages about architecture. Julien Guadet, 1834 to 1908, writes in the conclusion of his 4-volume work in French, but the title is Elements and Theory of Architecture, that the role of the architect is to conceive, to think, and to construct. But China was a society without architects. The classical Chinese language does not have a word for architect. It only has a word for builder-craftsman. And the people who controlled the building industry, the supervisors, were men like this, officials. The concept of an architect came to China only in the 20th century, and it came when students who had studied the profession abroad returned home. Until then, neither the conception nor the thinking were present, for in fact, a pre-modern Chinese architecture is archetypical. It is not chronotopic. That's the third reason. Fourth reason also takes a while to explain. The fourth reason scholars have continued to turn to Japan to study Chinese architecture is because of the 20th century history of the field. The birth of Chinese architecture as a field of modern discourse came in direct response to political realities. First Opium War, 1840 to 42, the resulting indemnity to Britain, the opening of treaty ports, the cession of Hong Kong. Second Opium War, 1860, fought against England and France, gives way to the burning of the European-designed gardens at Yuanmingyuan. Through most of this period, the Taiping Rebellion is raging, 1850 to 1864, maintained by Christian reformers centered in Nanjing and moving southward. 1900, the Boxer Rebellion aimed at 8 foreign powers. By 1900, the Chinese and the Russians are massacring each other at the Sino-Russian border near the Amur River. 1895, again 1904, 1905, the Chinese are fighting the Japanese, and Imperial China will collapse in 1911. These decades of unequal treaties, of mistrust of Western ideas, nevertheless forced on China a realization that she had to reckon with Westernization, including the scientific inquiry that accompanied it. And in an extraordinary moment of vision whose impact is still felt today, the U.S. decided that instead of taking reparations from China for suffering during the war, the Boxer Rebellion, the Chinese would be required to use a percentage of that money to pay for the education of Chinese students at U.S. universities. And thus, the Boxer Indemnity Scholarship Program was set up in 1909. It funded the selection, preparatory training, transportation to the United States, and study for scholarship beneficiaries. Part of the money included the establishment in 1911 of Tsinghua College, a preparatory school for Chinese students seeking to study in American universities. It later expanded to a 4-year undergraduate and then to a postgraduate program that became Tsinghua University. Today, classes were taught in English, and yes, these are Beaux-Arts buildings. Hu Shi, president of Beijing University, famous philosopher Feng Youlan, and the man at the top right, who we'll hear more about, Liang Sicheng, were famous recipients of the Boxer Indemnity Scholarship. At least 30 recipients came to the United States to study architecture, and at least 20 of them came to the University of Pennsylvania. This is a group leaving China to study on Boxer Indemnity scholarships. They came to Penn. They found in class, third from the left on the second row, Louis Kahn, and 2 to his right, Yangting Bao. They were classmates. The most famous recipient of a Boxer Indemnity Scholarship was this man, a Boxer Indemnity Scholarship to study Chinese architecture, Liang Sicheng, shown here in 1905 with his famous father, Liang Qichao, on the right, just as he entered the Tsinghua Preparatory School. He came from Tsinghua to Penn. He married his classmate Lin Huiyin. They both studied at Penn 1924 to 1927. He worked in an architectural firm. And on the way home, they took the grand tour of Europe, where he made paintings of monuments that he had studied in class, like the one on the right. A second highly influential architect, architectural historian, was this man, Liu Duanzhen. He was a few years older than Liang. He received a strong education in classical Chinese beginning at the age of 4 in his clan school in Hunan, with the expectation that he would take the official exams and become a Chinese scholar official. This was not to be. He went on to a progressive school in Hunan and Changsha, and then in 1913, he became a student in Japan on a different Chinese government scholarship program. He entered engineering in 1916 and transferred to architecture in 1917. He graduated in 1921 from Tokyo Higher School of Technology with an education that combined practical design and the study of Japanese, European, and a little Chinese architecture. Chinese architecture came to him by way of men like this. These are the years of the Japanese occupation of Manchuria. And so the archaeologists, architectural historians came back to Tokyo, and they taught men like Liu Duanjun in their class. 1923, Liu returned to China. He established a program in architecture at Suzhou Specialized School of Technology that eventually moved to Nanjing University. Now, Liu had also seen wooden buildings. He had seen most of the oldest buildings that I showed you at the beginning. And in 1928, he began writing scholarly articles. They included studies of how Chinese architecture could be understood through Japan's earliest wooden buildings. He conducted his first field trip in 1931. This is the group preparing. It lasted 2 months. The students had more than 20 pieces of luggage that included camera equipment, measuring equipment, and the government guaranteed them safe passage on trains to do their work. This was actually earlier than Liang Sicheng's first field trip, but Liang's trip was later in the year 1931, and it identified this building, which was the earliest known Chinese building at the time, the Guanyin Pavilion of Dula Monastery. 6 years later, Liang would have what could be described as the field-defining discovery of his career, 1937, a Tang Dynasty building on Mount Wutai, where Edwin had gone, with the dated inscription of 857. Now there's a building 127 years earlier than the one that he had found in 1931. These two buildings fit perfectly into the archetype, a great tradition of Chinese architecture that anticipated what one saw in the Forbidden City. It also confirmed a classical tradition, such as the one that he had studied at Penn, one that could lead into a Renaissance and a Baroque and a neoclassic and ultimately a Beaux-Arts tradition, which came to be built in China when the architects who I've just mentioned returned. And Liang found compatibility in Japan. So top is China, bottom is Japan. This is a study that Liang did where he compared curved beams and ceiling types of a building in Japan dated 756 and one in China that he had found, and assumed that the Chinese prototypes were missing, perhaps would be found, perhaps no longer survived. Liang and Liu worked together in the Institute for Research in Chinese Architecture in Beijing. They went together to Sichuan and Yunnan when the institute relocated in the 1930s and 40s, when the Japanese bombings made it impossible for universities or many institutes to stay either in Nanjing or Beijing. Liang and Liu took field trips together. They published together. And they and others who returned from study abroad and joined their efforts came to be known as the first generation. They had 6 components to their task. They were educators, they had contemporary design firms, architectural historians, textual researchers, historic preservationists, and field workers. We are now on the 4th generation. People in Beijing trace their lineage to Liang. People in Nanjing trace their lineage to Liu. They shaped the field, and they wrote the textbooks that are still used today. They believed in an East Asian architectural tradition that began in China. It's easy to understand why Bannister Fletcher's famous Tree of Architecture, which Liang had first seen when he used this Bannister Fletcher book as a textbook at Penn, continued to be used in China. So I've got a blow up from a different version on the right, but as you see, the archetype and the label under is Chinese-Japanese, one unified tradition. I'm still explaining the 4th reason. The other side of the political aspect of the emergence of Chinese architectural history based on Sino-Japanese archetypes is more problematic. Some of the Japanese archaeologists and architectural historians who conducted research in China and Korea during the years of occupation of Manchuria sought to show Japan to be the true, valid, superior East Asian repository of the Buddhist tradition. They looked to a building like this, the Phoenix Hall of the Byodo-in in Uji. Japan thereby became the caretaker of what the Chinese had not preserved themselves and the place where a tradition from even farther west than China, ultimately a Buddhist tradition from India, had come to its highest resolution. The idea of Japan as the final destination of Buddhist art and architecture based on Tang models positioned Japan as the pinnacle of East Asian civilization and the repository for its most glorious artistic achievements. It was another means by which Japan could fit into geopolitical ambitions of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Well, the fact is the Tang was an international age, and we learned this as recently as the last few years. So what you are looking at here is the inside of a tomb at a place called Shorum Bambagar in Bulgan, Mongolia, that was excavated in 2009. I'm showing you now the plan on the top, and below it is the plan of a tomb dated circa 706, first decade of the 7th century, in Chang'an, the capital of the Tang dynasty. You see that even the air shafts come down to then the main chamber. This is not a well-published tomb, so I'm showing you a few of the murals. If I didn't tell you that these are sitting in Mongolia, I think that those of you who know Tang painting would say they come from Chang'an. They certainly come from that tradition. And these two examples of sculpture also come from the tomb. But even more interesting, the one comparison that I want to emphasize is that on the right you're looking at a line drawing of a building above an archway on top of the entry to the back chamber of a tomb dated circa 710 in Chang'an, and on the left you're looking at a building from Shorum Bambagar with the same, in the same position, and that's what I'm looking for, extraordinarily here, if you look really closely, right here, this is what you're looking at. The one in Mongolia even has the auspicious cranes, the good omen, that as far as I know, we don't have in any of the Chinese prototypes. But the fact is that our evidence of an international Tang still comes primarily from pictorial evidence. People still look at this woodcut done in the Song dynasty of the Jetavana monastery. They still look at transformation paintings of Buddhist paradises from the walls of Morgal caves at Dunhuang. We still have only 4 wooden buildings, and we have just a few more pagodas than that number. But if we look 1 century before the Tang, we have a very different image of East Asia, and it is indeed an international image. So China in the 6th century looks something like this. I'm beginning on the left. It begins with the movement of the Northern Way, their capital in, I hope you can read these. If I point, it's going to take me more time, but I'll do a little pointing. Capital right here, falls 493, and move to Luoyang. So that then takes us into the 6th century. In 534-35, the Northern Way splits into Eastern and Western Way. That's easier to see on the middle map. We have 2 more capitals now, one in Chang'an and one in Ye, which is in southern Hebei in 550. Eastern Way becomes Northern Qi, Western Way becomes Northern Zhou. They end in 577 and 581 respectively. And in the south, the capital remains in Jiankang. That's the city that is Nanjing today. We go from southern Qi, 479 to 502, to Liang in the middle, 502 to 57, and then Chen, 557 to 589. The sizes of the empires change, the capital doesn't, so we have 8 dynasties, 5 capitals, and only the southern rulers native Chinese. We begin in the city called Pingcheng on the map on the left, the city that's today Datong. This is the earliest Chinese monastery now known through excavation. It's called Siyuan Fuose. It's dated to the end of the 5th century because it's assumed to date before the transfer of the capital to Luoyang in 493. I am going to be interested in what might be up here later on. It is due south of this tomb, the tomb known as Yongguling. This is the tomb of Empress Dowager Wenming. She was laid to rest in 484. The monastery may have been part of her funerary complex. The tomb may have been constructed in response to the monastery. The only significant structure at that monastery is the pagoda that I showed you. If we seek a precedent for a monastery with one large pagoda, so here again, Suyuan Fosu, we probably have to go to the Taklamakan Desert, the southern Silk Road, southern part of Xinjiang province, where we have monumental towering pagodas as the focus of monasteries. So that's our first kind of plan. Our second capital in China gives us a different plan. There also was a towering pagoda. All that survives is the base, the Yongning Monastery, built in 516 by order of Empress Dowager Hu, burns to the ground in 534. We read that it had more than 1,000 monks' courtyards, single and multi-story halls, located amid greenery, so that in its entirety, even the Great Hall on Mount Sumeru and the Palace of Purity and the Touche to Heaven were no match for it. We have no reason to doubt that the Empress Dowager's monastery was splendid, but we know nothing specific beyond what you see on the map, a gate, a pagoda with 2 rings of columns, outer and inner, and a Buddha hall behind it that was smaller. A third kind of monastery came to light in the year 2002. You're looking at a pounded earth platform about 40 meters square. It's located 1,300 meters south of the remains of the wall of the Eastern Wei Northern Qi capital at Ye. This is the city to which the eastern part of the Northern Wei went when the Northern Wei fell, or split, I should say. We are again looking at a central pillar pagoda. We are looking at 2 rings of columns, just as we saw at the Yongning Monastery pagoda. It's given the name of the town where it was excavated, the Jiaopengcheng Pagoda. Smaller in dimensions than the Yongning Monastery, but as I said, the same plan, and we assume that it is imperial or had imperial patronage because there's a reliquary crypt that had precious objects. 2010, more excavation comes to light, and now we have 2 symmetrical platforms with a monument in each one, and these are larger than the pagoda, and the belief is, than the central pagoda. Perhaps this is a pair of twin pagodas. We can't rule out that possibility. These are about 100, the platform's about 110 meters on each face. Also in the 21st century, excavators returned here. By returned, I mean that in the 1950s, something was found here that's now covered over. It was this burning lantern pagoda. No one came back for more than 50 years. You'll hear how this plays into the history of Chinese architecture tomorrow. But it turns out that the monastery is recorded in the record of Taiyuan Prefecture. Taiyuan Qianzhi says that it was founded in 556. Here's the plan. And again, we have our second example, and again, it's Northern Qi. We have our entry, we have our 2 symmetrical structures, another building, and the burning lantern pagoda is, I think it's over here on this, it's here, and then here are the remains of the monastery. The standard history of Northern Qi tells us that the Emperor Gaoyang climbed here and had a great Buddha carved into the cliff, and this is what the cliff looks like today, and indeed there almost definitely was a great Buddha carved here. So we have 3 plans from the 6th century in China, each associated with a different capital, the one in Datong, the one in Luoyang, and then our Northern Qi plan that we have, for which we have 2 examples. Each one spreads to Korea. And just for reference, Buddhism comes to Koguryo in 372, to Pekchen 384, and to Shilla in 527, and there is a different monastery plan associated with each one. So beginning with the earliest, Koguryo, we're in the vicinity of Pyongyang. The capital was moved here in 427, so we date this to the 5th century or later, where we have our pagoda and 3 Buddha halls, and maybe also Buddha halls here, and how you're looking at it, pagoda and Buddha halls behind it. Sometimes the Buddha halls come on 3 sides of the central pagoda. The central pagodas in Koguryo are octagonal. This is the reason that I wanted to come back here, one large central pagoda, our earliest monastery plan. There is something up here, we don't know what, but perhaps a line of Buddha halls from which we only have one. Second monastery plan associated with the Pekche kingdom. The earliest Pekche monasteries date to the 520s, the last right up to 668 before Pekche's fall to Showa. The 4 I show you here are in the vicinity of Puyo, and they all have the plan from Luoyang, the Yongning Monastery plan. How to interpret the plan of Pekche's most famous monastery, Miroksa, is subject to debate. Maybe it's 3 examples of our gate, pagoda, Buddha hall. Maybe it's 1 pagoda and 3 Buddha halls behind it. The third kingdom, Shilla, is where we find the twin structures. This is the remains of Hongnyon Monastery, and the fact that it was founded in 528 makes it very interesting because our earliest evidence of twin structures, presumably pagodas, here, perhaps here and here, from China is a little bit later. It's northern Qi. So right now, Korea may have the oldest example of this. And then we come to Shilla's most famous monastery, the Hwangnyeongsa, where we have 3 plans, and they are, in fact, the 3 plans that we see in East Asia, pagoda, Buddha hall. Then we get 3 Buddha halls, so this doesn't come first. And then we get the twin structures down here. Then Buddhism comes to Japan, officially in the year 538 with the presentation of an image from the king of Pekche. We see all 3 Korean monastery plans, and we see 2 more. Yes, my dates here are now in the Tang Dynasty, but I'm allowing for movement of imagery and religion from the 6th century in China and Korea to Japan. And we are looking at the earliest evidence of Japanese monasteries. What we're looking at here is from what's known as the Fujiwara capital in the vicinity of Asuka, south of Nara. So we begin on the left with the Asuka-dera, founded in 588. Number 1 is a pagoda. We have 3 Buddha halls around it. On the right, a plan that's a little more challenging. The second of the 4 great monasteries of the Asuka capital has a pagoda and a Buddha hall and 2 gates. And the only precedent that I know of for this takes us to city planning in China, where we have 2 gates and we have 2 sets of structures behind, one the Hall of Audience and the other the palaces. And this indeed is the plan that we find in the Nara capital in Japan, but there isn't such good evidence to say that city planning and monasteries share a plan, but it is worth considering. What's more interesting is that we see in Japan with our 3rd monastery now the unity with 1 gate, the Kawada-dera, and the pagoda is now becoming smaller and the Buddha hall is becoming larger. And then the latest of the 4 great monasteries gives us our twin pagodas. The monastery on the left, the 3rd of the monasteries from the capital at Asuka, is located near a monastery called Tachibana-dera. So here's Kawada-dera, and here's Tachibana-dera, first built in 601, gate, pagoda, Buddha hall, gate. It's our Pekche, or Yongning Monastery plan, but in reverse. Conceivably, the reason for this plan is that orientation here had to occur in response to topography, but Chinese and Koreans and Japanese like to orient their important buildings to the south, so we go from here to here. One possibility, it can't be proved, but we can prove that the plan of the gate and the pagoda and the Buddha hall and the gate is widespread in Japan before the year 600. It's associated with a man known as Prince Shotoku, who was regent for his aunt when she was empress, Empress Suiko, and he built or designed not only the Shitennoji in 583, but he designed the first version of what is going to become the Horyuji, so gate, pagoda, Buddha hall, and now you have a unified plan of the kind that we saw in the capitals from Nara. So 5 plans, as you see them here, from Japan. The international 6th century. Let's see what happens when we take a look at a tomb. You're looking here at the tomb of King Muryong, 462 to 523, Paekche Kingdom in the city of Gongju. It's distinguished by layers of alternating horizontal and vertical bricks. We have 4 rows often in the horizontal layer. Paekche is located just across the sea from Shandong Peninsula. Jiankang is the city Nanjing, and people have always assumed that influences from China crossed the sea and came into Paekche. And we have good physical evidence of this. On the left is the interior of one of the several tombs excavated in the vicinity of Nanjing from the period of the Southern dynasties, one of the 7 worthies tombs. You see the arrangement of bricks that we're looking for. Most people don't know about the tomb on the right. It was published in December of 2008. Even better evidence because it has a 3rd century date, and it's from the city of Nanjing. But things aren't always that simple. So here I juxtapose King Muryong's tomb with a tomb from Gansu province in western China with a date of 3rd, 4th century, where we have the same kind of brick formation. And this could work if we like to see things moving unilinearly. This is Gansu, Jiuquan and Jiayuguan, where I'm looking right now, are here. And then we have Nanjing here, and we're going to be looking at Datong right here in a minute, and we have Paekche right here. But the fact is, if we look at a different Korean kingdom, the Goguryeo kingdom, which I have on the top, and we look at a slightly different place in Gansu province, we have a tomb with 2 chambers connected by a corridor, what we saw in the Forbidden City at the very beginning. And when we look inside these tombs, we have the world of the heavens at the top, and we have the world of man below, and we even have shared specific imagery like a large flowering tree and a large flowering tree. And if we go to the city of Datong, we can look at the tomb that I show you on the left with 2 chambers connected by a corridor. And I'm especially interested in this tomb because this man, Song Xiaozu, was born in Dunhuang. He was born in Gansu province. His family was relocated by the Northern Wei after his kingdom fell. He ends up an official in the city of Datong. He and his wife are buried in this tomb. And another tomb from the region shows the same hierarchic deities at the top and then the world of man below. And perhaps we should be tracing this to a Han Dynasty source, the world of the heavens, the world of eminent men, most eminent men, emperors, and then eminent paragons of filial piety below from the famous Wu family shrines. What I've just shown you is that based on dated physical evidence, Goguryeo and Paekche, 2 different kingdoms, were both constructing tombs in the manner of tombs in Gansu. The Jiuquan and Jiayuguan are literally just a stone's throw away from each other. 2 different kinds of tombs that go to 2 different Korean kingdoms. The 6th century not only shows China to be the source of architecture and imagery in Korea, there is sufficient evidence to talk about more than one center in China and to its spread to different kingdoms of Korea, suggesting perhaps more distinction among the Korean kingdoms than we sometimes realize. We don't have this kind of tomb information to take the comparison to Japan. And then there are just a very few standing buildings from China. This is one, it's actually a pillar, the pillar of righteousness, kindness, and beneficence, 6.6 meters in Dingxing County of Hebei, a firm date of 587. The structure on top looks like this. The platform is 28 centimeters and the base 79 by 69 centimeters. So it's a very small building, but I want you to notice two features. One is that we have entasis. We have a swelling of the pillars here, and the second is this arch that's known as a Chaitya arch because we see it at the entry to Buddhist architecture in India. That's your bottom right. And we see it proliferate in the 6th century in China. The other feature that proliferates in the 6th century in China is this, that people call an inverted V-shaped brace, or they take the name of the Chinese character Ren and they call it a Ren-shaped brace, and we see this proliferate in the 6th century also. Now, the only way to go from here is to look at what we might call peripheral or maybe quasi-architectural evidence, to look at details in relief and details in painting. I want to show you just a few of them from one cave site to show what this kind of evidence offers in terms of reconstructing the 6th century. So I'm at a cave site called Maijishan. It's in Gansu province, the eastern part of Gansu province, east of the sites I've mentioned so far. Cave 43, a fluted octagonal column. Cave 4, large, enormous owl's tail decoration and a 7-bay building. Cave number 4, inside, a very unusual ball at the center, meeting point of 2 rafters on the roof and the same ball at the corners, and this perhaps also has a Han source. You're now beginning to see more Han sources as I get deeper into the lecture. So this is easier to see in line drawing. This is a medallion that was found on a Han Dynasty sarcophagus, and we have this ball at the center of the ceiling. What we call an inverted, what we call a truss, but with no post here, no king post. This is our first hall on Mount Wutai, our second hall on Mount Wutai. People always wonder if we should have this feature. Maijishan tells us in the 6th century we didn't see it. Here is what Liang Sicheng was looking for. The curved beam that we have in the East Hall in China, we have it in Japan, but we have it at Maijishan in the 6th century. And this very interesting feature, the suspended fish, Geigyo in Japanese or Xuanyu in Chinese, we see this in much later architecture, especially in Japan. We have it here, 6th century in China. Sarcophagi, sarcophaguses, provide the other kind of evidence. We have many of them from the Tang Dynasty, but like the Tang buildings, they're kind of generalized. They don't give us the kind of specific information that I'm about to show you from the 6th century. And by way of background, we have evidence of architecture from sarcophaguses as early as the 5th century on the left. We have many examples, such as the one on the right from the Han Dynasty. Our official Song Xiaozu was buried in this sarcophagus, and it has our inverted V-shaped brace and our very simple bracket arm with just 3 parts at the top. Our octagonal column that we've seen proliferates in the 6th century, but we take it back to the 4th century on the bottom left, and we take this back to the Han Dynasty also, and that's what you're looking at on the top right. Across the river, Museum of Fine Arts, we have this sarcophagus. It belonged to Ning Mao, who died in 527. It has the 3 fundamental components, that is the elevation platform, the walls, and the roof, and also the 3 pieces of a wooden frame, bracket set layer, the column layer or pillar layer, bracket set layer, and roof frame layer in wood. Kind of generalized, but sometimes when we're lucky, we get specific features. These are pieces of a wooden sarcophagus. It belonged to a man named Shudi Huiluo. He died in 562. He was buried with his wife the next year, and we have very specific bracket sets, and we even have a kind of brace with 3 little flutes on it, Timu, that we find in later architecture as well. And this is how it looked on the left when it was found. On the right is how it's been reconstructed. But the sarcophagus I am most interested in is this one. It belonged to a man known as Master Shur, who died in the year 579, was buried in Xi'an. The bracket sets are a little bit more complicated, but this feature is the one that is most interesting. So we've got our 3 pieces on our bracket set, and we've got a block, and then we've got another little piece right there. It has a name. It's called Mindo. We also can find it in painting in the Muagal caves back in the Tang Dynasty, but I'm pushing all these features that we've associated with the Tang back, as you can see. I'm also emphasizing the fact that this kind of evidence that I'm using is excellent not only for specific features, but to emphasize this idea of archetypes, what I said at the beginning. We have what we would call archetypical features. So we have in this small-scale structure excavated in Henan, circa 600, it's an undated tomb, enormous owl's tails. Rafters that curve, and wood really couldn't work this way. Enormous bracket arms. You'll see why I'm interested in them in just a minute. We have to have a tiny bracket set, but it couldn't support anything. We even have a band with lotus petals on either side. We have pilasters, all the features that we need to tell us we have the archetype of China. I showed these buildings to get back to Japan, because the small buildings raise the same issues as using Japanese buildings to inform us about lost wooden architecture in China. The place one turns most often is the Buddhist monastery Horyuji. This is the monastery founded by Prince Shotoku, at least the original part down here was founded by Shotoku. It's fitting to turn here because 10 of our 22 oldest wooden buildings in Japan are at the Horyuji, and we're most interested in 4 of them. The Buddha Hall, known in Japanese as the Kondo, an unusual structure by any measure in East Asia. It's a 1-story building. It appears to be 2 stories with an extra set of roof eaves, but I'm interested in it because we have our Mindo here. We have this extra piece, or Sarato. We have a curved cloud-patterned bracket arm, and we have our inverted V-shaped braces. Same features on the gate from the Horyuji, what's known as the central gate. These cloud-shaped bracket arms, our inverted V-shaped braces. We also have entasis in pillars. I show you only this picture of the pagoda to mention that it has a central pillar running through it, and in the covered arcade, we have our curved beams. So in the 3 buildings that we look at, we have the features that are going to figure most prominently in our definition of the archetype, and we'll see now where it traces. Now, what's the date of these buildings? The date of everything at the Horyuji is controversial. I don't have time to explain the controversy. Everything has to have been there before the year 747 because all of these buildings are mentioned in an inventory of the monastery. People and I also use the date 710 for what you see here. Again, we're in the Tang Dynasty. There is some thought that maybe the original buildings from Shotoku's monastery or buildings that looked like them were moved. Maybe there were some old building parts used, maybe not. We have other evidence from Japan earlier than the Horyuji to show some of the features that I'm interested in, like the very long bracket arm, like the cloud patterning. Same thing here at a shrine that's dated to the mid-7th century. Everything that I have just shown you in the 6th century in China and at the Horyuji, the fundamental features are found in 3-dimensional evidence from the second part of the Han Dynasty in China, the 1st and 2nd centuries. So here you're looking at our long bracket arms and the fact that they undulate, not exactly in a cloud-like pattern, but they undulate. Here we're looking at our inverted V-shaped brace, and here we've gone to Liaoning province in the northeast to show it. I wanted to show you that the Horyuji Pagoda has a central pillar, because here we're looking at our central pillar, and this is a cave, not Buddhist. This is a tomb in Sichuan province. These tombs are in the region of the Three Gorges, near the city of Leshan. And if we had time to talk about ceilings, you would learn that many of the ceilings that we associate with later times in China also trace to the Han Dynasty, and these are some of them. In other words, information from Han suggests that indeed China probably is the major generating force of architecture in East Asia, but perhaps the prototypes are Han, perhaps they will trace even earlier. 5 concepts have been central to this talk, and at least 4 of them will continue to be important tomorrow and Thursday. First, Chinese architecture can be described as a closed system. This is a term used to describe the interaction of parts in the natural and social sciences. Sometimes it's traced to Hegel's attempt to explain historical development as a dynamic process. To the biologist Ludwig von Bertalanffy, 1968, to him an open system was one in which there's an exchange between matter and its environment, or in which there are import and export of components. A closed system is one that functions fully without interchange. Chinese architecture has been almost exclusively a closed system. Almost nothing from the outside penetrates, but instead China exports to open systems like these, and therefore is always identifiable. I showed the Han material to emphasize not only that what we sometimes assume came from India, like a central pillar cave, existed in Han China, but when we look at a map and see where the Han had their commanderies, we can see that construction remained in those places even after Han fell. It was there for the taking by anyone from Koguryo to well into Xinjiang province today. My second point, relevant only today, is to suggest a parallel with Peter Brown's field-defining term late antiquity, dated variously from circa 250 to circa 750. And I'm about to adapt from his book with Glenn Bowersock and Oleg Grabar. And what I put on the screen, what I'm about to read to you, I've used the word Han every time he writes ancient Rome. I've put in China's classical age when he writes ancient Greece, and I've substituted Buddhism for Christianity, and this is what you get. The Han past was interpreted and often remade during the 6th century and perhaps earlier through palaces and monuments to emperors that stood alongside or on the ruins of houses of Buddhist practicing emperors. Philosophical writings of China's classical age and Han were still read, albeit selectively, and known to writers who shaped the more Buddhist philosophical tradition of the 5 centuries following the fall of Han. Mendicants and clergy, some sponsored by the church and others with sectarian beliefs, wrote and proselytized. Ethnicities were many, they mattered, and the pre-Han and Han concept of the barbarian was an important factor in these centuries of war and violence. Empires and smaller states rose and fell across the farthest reaches of the old Han Empire. Buddhism dominated life and thought, but other religions gained momentum and were present, and amid all the turmoil, families continued and occasionally prospered on farms, as craftsmen, in trades, and through mercantilism. And then I took another paragraph out of his book, and I did the same thing. That's at the bottom. Rulers in the Chinese period of late antiquity sought to construct a world of imperial power modeled after Han China. They were the greatest patrons of the age. They viewed architecture and cities as ways to identify themselves as supreme rulers of all the territory that had formerly belonged to Han, including Han's outpost commanderies and regions beyond those borders. Many of the rulers were Buddhist, still more of them patrons of monuments to glorify Buddhism. 3 more points. How does Han architecture or Chinese architecture come to be built outside of China? We readily say craftsmen and handbooks, yes, no doubt, and I think there is something else. In his study of understanding the past through memory rather than direct contact, Eviatar Zerubbabel justifies applying collective memory to ancient and non-European contexts, as well as modern Europe, which is his subject. This memory, or perhaps it's better to say this imagined vision of China, made it possible from the fall of Han until reunification in circa 600 for Chinese-style architecture to be constructed in Kew Gardens or in Korea or in Japan, and for it to appear on the walls of caves. Rulers saw Chinese architecture when they conquered, even if they destroyed only to rebuild it in its likenesses. A vision of something outside and what it symbolized would bear fruit in every part of Asia touched by China for many centuries after the 6th, particularly when parts or all of China were ruled by foreigners. Fourth, you've probably wondered why I haven't quoted more texts. I will do that in the 3rd lecture. But this push-pull between text, image, and excavation probably has been explored in every graduate seminar on any aspect of Chinese art since 1949. For the period that we are dealing with, the texts just don't give us specific enough information. I quoted from the record of Buddhist monasteries of Luoyang, Chinese of course, when I mentioned the Yongning Monastery of Empress Dowager Wu. Another quote from that text goes, "The emperor built cool wind tower on the terrace so that he could ascend to view the Luo River. Below the terrace were a curved lake and pond. To the east was another tower. To its east was the wooden angler's terrace that rose 20 zhang." We have a specific measurement. The hall had red pillars with carved rafters, and pictures of immortals were displayed in rows. The emperor came here to escape the summer heat. From the record of eminent monks, continued, in the year 520, the emperor repaired monasteries for his parents, one with 36 sub-temples, one with a 7-story pagoda. That's very specific. A main hall with 8 golden images, and lecture halls for more than 500 nuns. Another text about the city of Nanjing, written in the 8th century, tells us the Tongtai Monastery had a 9-story pagoda with 6 large halls and 10 smaller halls. There were meditational rooms, east and west platforms, trees, other plantings, and a pond. It took more than 10 years to complete, only to be destroyed by an earthquake. The texts support what we find, but they don't describe how the buildings are put together. They cannot be used except in conjunction with the sites. My methodology today, and largely in the next 2 days, is to turn to the buildings as the primary source. Sometimes those who write the texts have never seen the buildings about which they write. And then, of course, there are some buildings, including what we see tomorrow, that have never been recorded. What then about this reliance on architecture in miniature or in relief or in paint? Again, we do this primarily today. The validity of using small-scale objects that are surely, that are surely not replicas, but which replicate specific parts, has been with us for more than 70 years of Chinese architectural history writing. The first modern books about Chinese architecture explained everything before the 9th century with these kinds of examples or evidence. Rolf Stein continued to use them and other non-structural evidence in The World in Miniature, 1943. Old ideas may deserve to die, but often there is some value in them. For the 6th century, the period when we know both about Chinese architecture and how far it impacted beyond China's borders, this kind of evidence remains essential. Thank you. Took off here.
Well, I'm going to ask you to sit
Okay.
up here.
Seats marked. Okay.
Thank you so much. I will say that I think Nancy rarely, if ever, talks about a building she has not herself personally seen. I'm going to introduce both of our commenters and let them come up then one after the other. Our first discussant is Kyo Lippitt, professor of Japanese art history. He earned his BA here at Harvard before doing his MA and PhD at Princeton, and then coming back to teach here in the Department of the History of Art and Architecture in 2003, getting tenure 2 years ago? Yeah. His research interests focus primarily on pre-modern Japanese painting, with a special emphasis on Sino-Japanese painting associated with Zen Buddhism. He's taught at Heidelberg and Tokyo, been a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts and at the Getty. And he directs the arts program in academic ventures at the Radcliffe Institute. The best news, though, about Kyo is that his book just won the John Whitney Hall Prize at the 2014 AAS. So congratulations, Kyo, on that. That's great. And our second commentator, another colleague here at Harvard, James Robson, professor in the Department of EALC, got his PhD from Stanford. And specializes in the history of medieval Chinese Buddhism and Taoism. His book, Power of Place, won the Stanislas Julien Prize and the Numata Prize in Buddhism. He's now working, some of us have heard some of this work, on the history of the confluence of Buddhist monasteries and mental hospitals in Japan. He's one of the few faculty colleagues I was thinking of who is on the executive committee of both the Fairbanks Center and the Reischauer Institute. And so he really epitomizes this kind of straddling that Ed Reischauer does. It speaks to his extraordinary breadth and also to the fact that he's a really cool guy to hang out with. So I will turn things over then to first Kyo and then James, and then we will open the floor for questions.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Nancy. It's a privilege to be able to address this first lecture by Professor Steinhardt for the Reischauer series. And what I'd like to do first is to kind of, I think, situate slightly more panoramically what her efforts today, but more broadly, her intellectual and scholarly projects over the years have meant for East Asian architecture, because the study of East Asian architecture doesn't exactly constitute a field in the Anglophone sphere, in the sense that there aren't yet enough practitioners. There isn't a critical mass of knowledgeable specialists in Chinese and East Asian architecture to even constitute a discursive field. So what that means is that Professor Steinhardt has been freighted with a great deal of responsibility over the years to kind of generate the texts and the discourse that hopefully is turning into a field, a discipline. And I think recently things have begun to change a little bit. But this is an important point, because East Asian architecture is disciplinized in East Asia primarily as an engineering discipline, and it's taught in engineering schools in a pre-professional context with a strong emphasis on kind of constructionist approaches to the analysis of architecture, the reading of bracket sets, and the analysis of structure that is very much geared towards an engineering education, whereas architecture in the Anglophone sphere is, of course, taught as a kind of liberal art, a humanistic discipline, which is born out of the efforts to make architecture the equivalent of acts of other types of cultural representation, such as poetry and certain kinds of visual arts from the Renaissance onward. So Professor Steinhardt has been working very much within this space, this disjunctive space between the way East Asian architecture is taught in and studied in East Asia, and generally speaking, the way architecture is studied in the West. And of course, it is not, she has not chosen one mode or the other. It would be highly inappropriate to try to teach East Asian architecture on the model of Southern Renaissance architecture, because as she points out, there aren't really architects. There isn't the kind of cultural or professional equivalent of the architect working in China. And I think her approach, which is to really understand Chinese architecture as a system, as a vocabulary which unfolds based on specific typologies, and to understand the inner mechanics of how that system works, its regional variations, the cultural, social, political, historical context in which those variations evolve, in which drift takes place within that system, is a really wonderful one, which is also, I should say, very useful for the study of architecture in the East Asian region. She has found a wonderful language that is really adequate to the object of Chinese and East Asian architecture in her work. That's just a prefatory comment that I like to make before addressing the question of interregionalism. And here I think the real, for me, compelling interest and achievement of today's lecture is to take this mode of East Asian architecture, which is predicated upon this idea of a very large, expressive, heavy tiled roof whose weight is distributed to an outer perimeter or two rings of columns, so it doesn't have load-bearing walls, to create these flexible spaces which are partitioned flexibly. The space is radially conceived outward from a center, so it's flexibly appropriate to throne rooms or the worship of Buddhist icons set in the center and so forth, takes this mode of architecture. And traditionally, it has been understood to have disseminated in this very vague way throughout an East Asian macroculture for timber frame architecture, whose earliest buildings, as she points out, are really in Japan in the 7th century. And the entry point for studying this East Asian macroculture of timber frame architecture has traditionally been Japan and Nara and the buildings from the late 7th and early 8th centuries at Horyuji and elsewhere. And she has kind of relocated that entry point to various cultures of building and sites in China itself, thereby creating lots of ripple effects and all kinds of, necessitating all kinds of readjustments, which we're still all going to be in the midst of making for many years and decades to come. And of course, this is remarkable considering that there is so much new knowledge about architecture, as you saw in the lecture, coming out from archaeological excavations and so forth in this period in the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries and earlier and later, that it is a moving target, and that you really have to have this kind of assimilative, agglutinative intelligence that's constantly synthesizing new information within a larger scheme, well, within a larger history, which she has done very eloquently. Now, I just wanted to make two more observations about today's lecture and interregionalism, the first of which pertains to the consequences of understanding, of moving back some of the centrifuges for architecture that we associate with China in this period, from the Tang to earlier, to the pre-Tang era, which for me is very interesting in thinking about architecture in Korea and Japan, because you are talking about a decentralized period in China where you have multiple centers for government and multiple cultures of building. And this is especially interesting when one thinks about how Buddhism and the material culture associated with Buddhism disseminates throughout East Asia in these periods. Primarily, as Jonathan Best and others have pointed out, they disseminate through acts of diplomacy at the very top of the food chain. In other words, Buddhism, of course, doesn't disseminate through the proselytizing activities of lots of wandering itinerant priests or anything like that, but they are through acts of diplomacy where you kind of, preemptively and aggressively gift items of Buddhist culture or anything else to certain kingdoms in the Korean peninsula or clans in Japan, and then the architecture and other things follow. So what that means that is, instead of a Tang Empire, which is from which architecture is disseminating, you have multiple nodes or centrifuges from China from which architecture is disseminating. So that process is much more dynamic and related to the ever-evolving political alliances of the 5th and 6th and 7th centuries. And of course, there are 3 or 4 entities in the Korean Peninsula, many more in Japan, as well as China before Tang. And so it's just a much richer way of understanding the tapestry of how architecture is transposed and unfolds by moving it back from the Tang. I think that's a very important consequence for those of us working in places like Japan and Korea. And finally, I'd like to address this concept that Professor Steinhardt proposes about Chinese architecture as a closed system, which when it is transposed to other regions becomes an open system, is moved into context, I should say, in which there is an open system, and thereby it adjusts accordingly, is conditioned and inflected in slightly different ways by its new regional context. And I also find that very enriching for the study of architecture in, as she calls, the international East Asian sphere in this period. I think in some ways, for me, this is very similar to the idea of thinking about Chinese architecture as a vocabulary, as a certain habit of approaches which can be conceptualized as a vocabulary, which is adopted and possibly like a script, like Chinese script is transposed to Korea and Japan. Of course, in the Japanese case, I'm less expert in Korea, but you have sequences of characters that are read, of course, according to phonologically or logographically, but essentially according to Japanese syntax. And so you have an exterior, you have a script which seems to be the same, but which internally, linguistically, semantically is kind of adapting to new circumstances. And that's really what happens with timber frame wooden architecture in Japan, where you have buildings at Horyuji, which, as she points out, the Golden Hall, appear from the outside to be a second-story structure, which have 2 levels of roofs, which have a balcony surrounding what appears to be a second story, but you can't actually enter the building, climb up the stairs, and come out on the balcony and look out at your surroundings. It's too small a space. You would have to be 3 feet tall to actually do that. And the same is true of the pagoda at Horyuji, which is ostensibly a 5-story pagoda, but the term story here should be taken with a grain of salt, because outwardly there are 5 levels of roofs, but there are not 5 internal floors that can be inhabited in the way we assume stories can. All of the space inside is one continuous space. So what that means is this is not a 5-story building so much as a piece of architectural sculpture which conveys the sense to the outside world that one is looking at a high-rise pavilion, a grand high-rise tower pavilion appropriate to the typology of a pagoda which marks the presence of the Buddha's ashes. So what Professor Steinhardt has done for us here, I think, is given us, given this period, the locales which adopt the Chinese architectural system in this period, a lot of agency, instead of simply assuming that it's a diffusionist model in which there is a lot of copying and passively receiving or taking in. The locales are given a lot of agency to perform the operation of what you would call in Japanese kambun kundoku, the kind of the syntactical rereading of Chinese sequences of characters according to Japanese, but of course pertaining to, specifically in this case, to architectural vocabulary, thereby kind of differentiating in a very meaningful way the various cultures of building that we would find throughout this international East Asian sphere. And that's the conclusion of my talk. Again, thanks to Professor Steinhardt for a wonderful lecture.
Great. Thank you very much, Nancy, for that wonderful and very rich talk. So following Kyo is always tough because he actually knows something about architecture. And so I'm going to engage Professor Steinhardt's talk in a slightly different way, but try to open it up in some ways as well. I actually first met Professor Steinhardt through her work by meeting a student of hers, Tracy Miller, in China some 15 years ago. And she had such a passion for talking about bracket sets that it absolutely blew my mind. I had never met anyone like this before. She went on and on and on about bracket sets. I knew she had studied with Professor Steinhardt since she talked about her in such glowing terms that evinced a real respect and admiration. I was then very excited not to only meet, but also to travel to Western China with Professor Steinhardt some years ago, and it was a truly illuminating experience for me. We hung out quite a bit on that trip. I don't know if I was cool to hang out with or not, but I was so entranced by the casual discussions of architecture when we viewed different sites. It really does take a different type of looking and training of the eye, and she had such an encyclopedic knowledge of things that I probably bugged her a lot by tagging along and asking questions about all the places we were at. Today, Professor Steinhardt has presented a rather ambitious thesis of the flow of architectural influence from China to Korea to Japan. Her use of architecture in this way actually has close synergies with other recent scholarship on material culture and even textual and doctrinal work that seeks to see East Asia in a more integrated way, a place where ideas, practices, and objects were in motion, a much more dynamic picture that we still have not come to fully appreciate. But how did technology such as architecture and knowledge move? Were Buddhist monks the carriers of technology, or what role did they play? A few specific terms came to mind to me as I listened to Professor Steinhardt's lecture today, and I would say that the two are the words transformation and transposition, particularly as linked to miniaturization. I'd like to first underscore the point that she raised about the multifunctionality of the same architecture. Not just in terms of a model, but what we might call architectural transformation itself. Indeed, Buddhist monasteries enter the historical record as fundamentally transformed sites. A record in the Historical Digest of the Buddhist Order says, for example, that according to the explanation of names, the term si, or monastery itself, originally designated the name of a government office, a homophone, si. When monks coming from the West arrived in China, they temporarily resided within government offices. In order to not forget their original connection to government office, when they moved to separate institutions, they continued to use the word si in order to refer to their new residence. This is the origin of the name used for Buddhist monasteries, or the Sang Si. Other terms used for temples and monasteries, such as dian or tang or yuan, also derive from terms used for administrative offices. The initial connection between Buddhist monasteries and imperial administrative offices was retained in more than just name. Indeed, throughout later Chinese history, it became common for officials or elites to donate their private palatial residences in order to have them converted into monasteries. There were no major issues involved in this repurposing, or, as we might say today, upcycling. Although Buddhist Vinaya prescriptions state that, quote, the construction of a residence was not to entail the destruction of plant life or ancient sanctuaries belonging to other religions, we know that transformations happened on a grand scale. The transformations, or the multi-use of sites, comes out clearly from one temple record that I've read involving the Shengye Chan Si, and it goes like this. A source says that Yu of the Xia dynasty, one of the great old sages, built the refreshing palace in order to make offerings or to pacify an image of Shun, another great old sage of the past. During the time of Tang Wuzong, it fell out of use. Lady Yang Ziying granted some money to restore it, and the name was changed to the Gratitude to the Nation Monastery. Another record says, this is the old site of Yu's palace. During the Zhenghe reign of the Northern Song, it was renamed as the Shenqiao Gong, or the Divine Imperium Palace, a Taoist temple. Later, this Taoist institution was again converted back into a Buddhist monastery. So not only is the structure multi-adaptable, but the same actual place was being cycled through first an old shrine to sages, then a Buddhist temple, and then a Taoist temple, and then back to being a Buddhist temple. And never did they change anything about the structure. At different junctures of history, we even find imperial decrees for one religion to take over the buildings of a different tradition. The Tang writer Sun Yazhi, in one inscription, even, quote, celebrated the expulsion of monks from property seized from a local cult in Shanxi, and also lamented the spread of Buddhism at Confucianism's expense. As prevalent as these cases of sites that were transformed into Buddhist monasteries are, we should be clear that the transformation was not just in one direction, and Sun Yazhi's inscription goes on to suggest that by the Tang, there were backlashes against the Buddhists for their aggressive conversions of these places. Dumu, for example, wrote a commemorative inscription that notes that, quote, a Confucian pavilion was built with materials collected from destroyed Buddhist shrines. So even the parts themselves could be reassembled in these different ways. And I could go on and cite others. There's even cases of Buddhist monasteries then turning into Manichaean temples as well. So this type of conversion of architecture would not be surprising to scholars of other religions. During the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula in the 11th century, for example, Islamic mosques were converted into Christian churches, just as their churches had been converted into mosques a few centuries earlier. We also know that many Christian chapels in Egypt were established through the conversion of pre-Christian rock tombs, and that some megalithic monuments in Brittany were incorporated into early Christian churches. This seems to be akin to the model that Professor Steinhardt has suggested, with the formative models coming from Han architecture, but fully in place by the 6th century. As I was listening to Professor Steinhardt's talk, I kept asking myself about the role of texts in all of this, and it was at the very end that she weighed in on that, concluding that texts don't tell us enough. And I would say that's just like ritual texts as well. You can never perform a ritual with the text, nor could you build a monastery or a building. One might ask if texts really only confirm what is found in the material record, or can some texts alert us to certain developments? But rather than quibble with that claim, I think it's more important to mention the other important concept introduced briefly in Professor Steinhardt's talk, that is the usefulness of studying the miniaturization of architecture, something used to great effect, as she noted, by Rolf Stein in his classic The World in Miniature. But how to use such things as evidence, how to use those miniature sites. There is actually good evidence for this from other parts of the world that's presented in an elegant little article by Jonathan Z. Smith entitled Constructing a Small Place that might be worthwhile taking into consideration. He describes, for example, miniaturized versions of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre that resemble little playhouses. One description, he says, although such a Holy Sepulchre still replicates the architecture of the real Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, its architectural form loses its functional meaning. The object begins to strike the eye more like a large piece of sculpture than a small piece of architecture. It is as if the entire Holy Sepulchre had been reduced in size, shrunk to a model. He argues in a way very similar to the call at the end of Professor Steinhardt's talk, that miniaturization produces a kind of clarity missing from both the original and large-scale copies. He also invokes a shrewd observation by Levi-Strauss in his own meditation on miniaturization that says, quote, reduction of scale seems to result from a sort of reversal in the process of understanding. He goes further to say, to understand a real object in its totality, we always tend to work from its parts. The resistance it offers to us is overcome by dividing it. Reduction in scale reverses the situation. By being quantitatively diminished, it seems to us to be qualitatively simplified. In the case of miniatures, in contrast to what happens when we try to understand an object of real dimensions, knowledge of the whole precedes knowledge of its parts. The intrinsic value of a small-scale model is that it compensates for the renunciation of sensible dimensions by the acquisition of intelligible dimensions. I think it's a really interesting concept that, and you're onto something to keep using this theory that had been proposed in the past as well. So then, what about miniature stupas, which didn't come up in the talk today? This leads to one reservation that I'd like to mention in regard to what has been, Kyo mentioned as well, about the closed system model that is proposed. Professor Steinhardt did well to introduce, I think, the regional nature of architecture in cases of Korea and what went to Japan, and we do seem to find regional difference in Chinese architecture. I suspect that there is a paucity of extant buildings, but is there one thing called Chinese architecture that functions fully without interchange? As Edward Said has so elegantly formulated in a wonderful little book about beginnings, much less well known than his Orientalism, beginnings are always lead back to contested terrains. Is China the end of the road in tracking styles back to the West, or does it go to Central Asia or to India? I ask this to play the devil's advocate, of course. Indeed, it seems that Buddhists did not bring an elaborate architectural repertoire with them to China. But was Chinese architecture as closed as Professor Steinhardt has presented it? What about things like stupas that became iconic pagodas in China? I just raised that as a question. Or perhaps we might consider things called sutra repositories or scriptural pagodas, which is something that is indeed found at Horyuji in the 7th century, as well as at other sites in Japan, but is described in texts as, yes, like its predecessors in China, but also bears a close resemblance to Dao Xuan's description of such structures in his plan of the Jetavana Monastery of India. Ever since I first encountered Professor Steinhardt's scholarship, and even more importantly, ever since I had the chance to travel with her to many sites in Western China, I've never been able to look at built objects in quite the same way. Indeed, it's impossible for me to enter a temple or a shrine without looking up, to appreciate the bracket systems, and to look for inscriptions on main beams. I feel in some ways like I've walked into chapter 3 of Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, where we arrive at the Grand Academy of Legado. This academy is not an entire single building, but a continuation of several houses on both sides of the street. The traveler is received very kindly by a warden and went for many days to the academy. Every room has in it one or more what are called projectors, the scientists exploring different projects. The first man seen has been 8 years upon a project for extracting sunbeams out of cucumbers. But there was also a most ingenious architect who had contrived a new method for building houses by beginning at the roof and working down to the foundation, which he justified by referring to the like practices of those two prudent insects, the bee and the spider. One can read this material, as one may listen to Professor Steinhardt's lecture today, as an attempt at what I would call reversibility, or going back to the beginning to see things in new ways and propose new theories, or overturn accepted ones, turn buildings upside down, and even change the direction of the field. Even if I'm primarily a text scholar, you have certainly attuned my eyes to thinking about the ways that architecture can be read, especially from the top down, and I thank you for that. I'm very much looking forward to the fresh ideas that are to come in the lectures to follow over the next 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kyo and James. I think that Professor Steinhardt's lecture has been appropriately, dare I say it, bracketed by our two commenters. We're going to open the floor up for questions for about 10 minutes or so, and then we will adjourn to our reception. So recognize, if you could just say your name quickly.
Hi, my name is Xun Wen, and I'm a PhD student here in Narration and Architect Studies. And I want to follow up on what Professor Robson mentioned a little bit. He talked about the possible Central Asian influence in Chinese architecture, and here in your slide on the picture on the upper right corner is the sarcophagus. I don't know how to pronounce this thing. Sarcophagus. Sarcophagus from the Shijun tomb, right? So we're looking at the northern face of the object, but on the other side, on the southern face, which is the face that you will see when you enter the tomb, we find the only Chinese Sogdian bilingual epitaph that we have. And also, from what I read, a lot of art historians read Sogdian motifs in the relief around this object. So I was wondering so from a certain aspect, you could see this object as a Sogdian object and not a Chinese object. But from your perspective, it's in line with the tradition of Chinese architecture. So how do you think these two views would accommodate with each other, and how do you think that we should understand what, for example, Chinese architecture mean in this context? Thank you.
So I think your question proves my point. There definitely are Sogdian motifs. There are Sogdian deities. Shi Jun himself is a Sogdian. But he chose to bury himself in a Chinese building with bracket sets, with pillars, in fact, with a piece on a bracket set that exists in Japan and in a Chinese roof. So from where you're sitting, you can't see those decorative motifs. In fact, I don't see them here. I have to be standing in front of the sarcophagus. But from a distance, you're seeing a Chinese structure, and you don't even know that it's a sarcophagus. I think that's the point. The decoration can be Sogdian, and he himself can be Sogdian. I mean, if I can talk for a minute about the stupa and the open and the closed system, that's why when I was talking very quickly about the Chinese, about what should exist in Chinese architecture and space, I showed the pagoda. And I said it always sticks out as unnatural on the Chinese landscape. Now, the fact is, the single pagodas that I showed you from the Taklamakan Desert are stupas in Central Asia, and they date no later than the 4th century. But by the time we enter China, those roof tiles and bracket sets overtake them. So it becomes part of the Chinese system. But you're right. The stupa is the one structure that the Chinese never could figure out exactly how to accommodate. That's why there can be one, there can be two, it can be on the axis, it can be twin, there can be three, it can be in its own precinct. They never completely figured it out, and it looks unnatural. But you're right. Yeah.
Other questions from the floor? Paul Cohen.
Are there other architectural regional cultures globally which you would also characterize as closed systems? Or is the East Asian architectural heritage the only relatively closed system?
So maybe the closest would be Roman. But the problem there is that Rome doesn't survive for 5 millennia. Right, that there's change in the country that's today Italy. But there are certain, I mentioned Kevin Lynch, who writes a book, I think probably in the 1960s, The Image of Architecture, and uses this term imageability. There are certain building types that have very profound images. Medieval cathedral has a very profound image, even if you don't know if it's Romanesque or Gothic or which part of Europe it comes from. But what's different is how simple the Chinese building is. Something I didn't talk about, but it comes up, and I guess it will come up on Thursday. I'll talk about occasional use of stone. These are all perishable materials. There's yet this other layer, and this stick figure image, I mean, it never fails to amaze me that I can see an architect drawing a picture and he's using straight lines. You know, you can make a Chinese building with pickup sticks. You really can't do that with any other tradition. So it's extraordinary. So maybe it's unique on several levels, even beyond this image.
I'm going to suggest that we bring today's event to a close here and invite everybody to some refreshment outside. Reminder of tomorrow's lecture, The Liao Revolution in Building and Design is the title, and our discussants will be Professor Eugene Wong and Valerie Hansen from Yale University will be joining us to talk about the Liao. For now, we thank you very much for a very stimulating afternoon, and to our discussants as well. Thanks a lot.